On the line with us right now is the Deputy Editorial Director at Media Matters, Pam Vogel. MediaMatters.org, of course, is the website I recommended on the air here frequently, and they just do some really great work. Pam, welcome to the program.
Thanks for having me. You
had an article, and I believe I also got an email about it, about Boris Epstheyn over on Sinclair. Sinclair Broadcasting owns a couple of hundred TV stations around the country. I'm old enough to remember prior to 1987 when Reagan stopped enforcing the Fairness Doctrine. In fact, I worked at a television station in Lansing, Michigan in the early 1970s, and WJIM-TV. And whenever, which was maybe 3 nights a week, the station management, in fact, often it was the guy who owned the station, it was locally owned, would come on and he'd do a little 2 or 3 minute op-ed or editorial, and often it had to do with politics. Sometimes it was just, fix the potholes. But there was always, right after that, somebody from the community, it could be a politician, it could be, whoever, some local person who came on and offered the other side of the issue, rebutted what they said. The Fairness Doctrine required that. It didn't require that if a radio station carries an hour of Rush Limbaugh, they have to carry an hour of Thom Hartmann. But it did require that if a person who speaks for ownership or management of a radio or television station offers an opinion on the air, a contrasting opinion had to be offered. That's no longer the case. What's up with Sinclair now? How are they abusing this newfound power that they have since the Fairness Doctrine, since Reagan stopped enforcing it, and then Obama actually took it off the books a couple of years ago?
I think they've definitely, so to back up, Sinclair is pretty clearly has conservative owners. They're rapidly expanding, as you mentioned. And for a while, for almost 2 years, they had one commentator only, and that was Boris Epstheyn, who used to work for the Trump campaign and then was briefly in the administration and was a media surrogate appearing on like CNN, for example, to represent Trump. He came on board as their chief political analyst. He's now their chief political commentator. I think they're leaning a little more heavily into branding it as commentary. But for a very long time, it was just him. So they couldn't hide behind the sort of argument that, for example, Fox News would of saying fair and balanced or something like that. They really had literally one editorial voice. As of February this year, they actually did add on a liberal commentator named Amisha Cross. And the way that they structure his commentary segments now is that they have a rebuttal from her, and those air with a new topic about usually every weekday. Mm-hmm. But at the same time, they're also beefing up their right-wing programming. So it's not as though it's 50-50 now either. Yeah. So Sinclair is producing a ton of national programming from their corporate level that they're disseminating out into the stations that they control. And I don't want to say own, I say control because they use a lot of other FCC loopholes to effectively control and operate stations that they're technically not allowed to own, which is why that number is so high. So any Sinclair station that is a news station, some of them don't air news, but any that are airing news are required to air these almost daily commentary segments from Boris Epstheyn, from Amisha Cross. And then they're also airing several other types of programming that are, again, coming from the national level that all have a conservative bent. So they have another segment that's pretty regular called the Terrorism Alert Desk that is pretty strongly anti-Muslim and xenophobic. It's very focused on one specific and narrow definition of terror. And they're also showing some longer programming, like an hour-long weekly show from Eric Bolling, who used to work at Fox News. He was fired there following reports of sexual harassment and then hired by Sinclair. His show is very easily could be on Fox News. It's extremely conservative, and he doesn't really hide that either, although he kind of pays lip service to being fair, but in reality, if you look at the guests and his commentary throughout the show, it's not. And then they also offer some other sort of like Sunday political programs with different reporters who are either former Fox people or just known in the industry for being conservative and leaning in that direction.
Yeah, this is like peak Powell memo, take over the media, have our billionaire buddies, buy up media all across the country. It's happening. Now, Epstein was doing this fear-mongering rant about how immigrants are actually, we don't have so many immigrants these days. It's refugee seekers, asylum seekers are coming into this country and raping children was his shtick, right? And as if to suggest that people who are not citizens of the United States are much more inclined to be criminal and much more inclined to be criminal in ways that everybody finds repugnant. I mean, just horrible. Can you speak to that?
Yeah, I think there's a few sort of trends that this particular segment plays into. One is that Epstein's commentary in general tends to fall into one of two categories. Either it's like very, very bland and milquetoast, and it's basically just filling up time, agreeing with whatever Trump did that day, or purposely sort of highlighting something that's not in the news that might make Trump look better, or it's this type of segment where he's like leaning full bore into the most racist, xenophobic, fear-mongering type of rhetoric that, again, would not be out of place somewhere like Fox News or Rush Limbaugh or other places we know are just like complete Trump loyalists. So that is one thing. He's done a lot of segments like this in the past, and they've often been also around immigration. As we know, this talking point was, how Trump kicked off his election campaign in 2015. So it's no surprise that it keeps coming out of Epstein's mouth, too. So this is I think the latest of, I would say, 1, 2, 3, 5 or 6 other segments that have just driven a ton of completely warranted outrage because he's fear-mongering around immigrants. It's very clearly what's going on here. And I think so that is one trend. And then I think also he's kind of, well, I think part of it is too that these commentary segments are so short and so vague that they can't provide the context to make them factually relevant or accurate for viewers anyway. So obviously there's this bigger part of sustainable, repeated rhetoric that's damaging and has nothing to do with facts, but then also the actual facts of the segment don't add up either. So, for example, the cases that he's citing to make this point are completely, contextless. He's not offering almost any details about any of the cases. He's purposely combining things that aren't related. So one of the things he brings up in this segment, for example, is about a Virginia police officer who was suspended for breaching the official department policy, which was to not cooperate with ICE by turning over a driver that he stopped in relation to a traffic accident. This has nothing to do with the actual point Epstein was attempting to make about violent crime, but he just sort of throws it in there because the segment is only 90 seconds. So he has the luxury of sort of just vaguely throwing in a few sentences that he thinks might, prove a point without having to go through and actually back up what he's talking about.
Pam, this sounds like propaganda to me.
It is, and that's sort of what it gets back to, too, is that this rhetoric is repeated. So it doesn't have to be factually accurate at the end of the day. If you're hearing the same thing over and over again, Sinclair would make the argument defending segments like this by saying, well, it's only a very small part of any local news station's actual programming. 90% of your local news station that's owned by Sinclair or operated by Sinclair is showing local programming or syndicated stuff like entertainment shows at night. They're not showing Boris's segment for that long. And that's true, but they don't need to, because hearing 90 seconds of some form of this rhetoric, whether it's something very extreme like this latest example, or whether it's that sort of milquetoast stuff that's just sort of repetitively trying to make the point that something is, going well for the Trump administration, it all adds up. Propaganda relies so heavily on repetition.
Well, and I would argue that if he's doing these little segments, on a station that's also carrying Dancing with the Stars or whatever, programs that Americans like to watch that don't seem to have any kind of political edge to them, that is actually adding credibility to his riff. It's making it seem like his riff is coming out of a place in the middle, out of an unbiased place. If most of the rest of the programming around, unlike Fox News, you watch Fox News and you look at the programming around, the periodic rants, and it's all crazed right-wing stuff, and everybody figures that out right away. That's not the case with Sinclair, which I think actually adds to the potency as well as the credibility of these segments that Boris is doing that I'm saying are propaganda.
Absolutely. I mean, part of the reason why I focus my research so heavily on Sinclair is because it makes me frustrated on an emotional level, because I feel like they're taking advantage of local news viewers.
Yeah.
There's nothing on the bottom of the screen that says Sinclair. You associate your local news stations more likely with whatever affiliate they are, an ABC affiliate, an NBC affiliate. You're not thinking about who the owners are behind the scenes, and they're not advertising that. So, and there's all sorts of studies and data that show that generally trust local news sources more than national sources, partly because you see your local news anchor, you're waking up and watching them talk about the stories of the day every day. They're talking about traffic. You might see them out and about at the grocery store. So you have like an inherent trust built into it because they're a member of your community. And so in some ways, what I also find frustrating about the Sinclair model is it's not good for viewers. It's also not good for a lot of those local reporters who just want to do their jobs and now have to have, slice off time from a segment they want to do because they need to fit in this 90 seconds or, at this point longer because you're doing two segments into their newscasts. They could be spending it on other things, and it's damaging their credibility.